you should allocate costs, I want to think about how we should be identifying the costs within your business to allocate. And I think that brings us to the concept of scoping, which is very important for DFAR 7012 and CMMC. I think back in 5, 6 years ago when these standards kind of really started becoming more popular, everyone focused on the requirements, right? But we have to keep in mind, it only applies to where the CUI lives, right? What is processing, storing, and transmitting? What are your system boundaries to where you're applying these requirements? And to that end, in late last year, the DoD released its scoping guide. To be honest, I was expecting a larger document, but don't let it deceive you. There's a lot within those pages. It describes, essentially, you should be classifying your assets, such as CUI assets, security protection assets, contractor risk managed assets, specialized assets, out-of-scope assets, right? If you're a large company with a large asset inventory, this is a very, very daunting task. But I think on the other end, once you complete it, it does put you in a good place as far as scoping your environment. And from a cost perspective, you can extrapolate those assets to understand the processes, applications, and people associated with those assets to get your arms around what is the cost of operating these CMMC requirements, right? And here I want to go back then to, again, Ms. Bosjanic's statement earlier, and especially the part where she says you don't get a direct charge to do it. Well, I'd say, well, why not? What if I have one contract that has the CMMC requirements? They're causing me to incur all these costs. Why can't I allocate all my costs to that one contract? Well, we have to remember the other side of the equation, benefits. What aspects of your business are benefiting from these requirements? And that really gets you into how you're implementing these requirements. So we're going to go through a couple examples of how you might architect your solution for CMMC and how you might treat the costs in different circumstances. So the first is going to be cloud. And I have a good example here for a client I work with. I was working with a large semiconductor company that you would not think of as a DoD contractor, right? Global, very big business, but they did have some DoD contracts for designing and engineering specific chips. And what they would do, knowing that they had to treat this information differently, again, they were kind of ahead of the game, very mature, and so I appreciated that. They would, for every DoD contract, they would set up a separate instance in the cloud in order to perform the work associated with that contract. So this allowed them to engage with a FedRAMP authorized cloud service provider. They could utilize all the services of that provider around things like encryption and monitoring and access control and, again, go down the list of the NIST requirements. Pretty much, the offerings that are in the cloud these days can allow you to meet them. So by that metric, they were doing really good on the security front. But for those of you who've worked with cloud service providers in the past, you will know that every month you will get a very detailed invoice of what is going on in that environment. Your services you're using, your processes, your storage. And because this client focused their environment so discreetly, they could directly associate the cost of each environment with the contract that they were working on. So in that regard, why wouldn't you be able to treat cost direct if you can track it down to this level of detail? And I'll note that not every cost was direct in these environments. They did have a team of professionals that were tasked with building the environments and conducting the ongoing security assessments. All the things would go on with maintaining these environments. They would handle the account provisioning and all that kind of stuff. Well, they pooled these costs together, and then they would allocate those costs across the contracts in a metric in accordance with CAS 418. So I thought that was a really good way to kind of approach this. Now, a key point on this before we leave it is if you are going to treat a cost as direct to a contract, you must propose it that way. You cannot tell the government, I will charge this to you as an indirect cost, and then invoice them as a direct cost, right? That's a violation of CAS 401, which is consistency in estimating, accumulating, and reporting costs. Big no-no. So definitely be aware of that if this is a path you might want to pursue. Another example is the secure enclave, right? And this is very popular for CMMC as well, or enhanced network segmentation. And it follows a similar kind of conceptual approach as the cloud. Essentially, you have a type of information that needs to be treated to a higher standard than what you're practicing within your production environment. So you create a special environment where you will be performing that work. And again, this provides you the opportunity to say, well, what are the costs associated with my enclave environment that are different from my production environment? It helps you to get your arms around what costs you're incurring and how those should possibly be allocated to contracts. One thing I want to note here, we've kind of talked about pulling apart some of these requirements and allocating them directly or through a separate pool, but I think there are some costs or some requirements in this 80171 that are probably better left with the business. And for example, this is 311.1 under risk assessments, assess the risk to the business of processing, storing, and transmitting CUI under DoD contracts, right? This is something saying, hey, enhance your risk management function, add this to the risk register. but I'm not really sure if it makes sense to get as granular, to pull this apart completely. Just make sure that all your costs are being allocated appropriately to their contracts. Okay, before we leave this, I want to touch on the concept of competitiveness, right? I know this is a big concern within the DIB. There are a lot of contractors that are kind of in that medium to lower tier of the supply chain. They're working under primes and often under fixed price contracts. And when they see this, they say, well, my costs are going to increase. I can't increase my costs to, I'm not being reimbursed for these on a dollar for dollar basis. It's got to come out of my profits. Well, as we discussed earlier, I do believe costs are going to go up across the board. There is no real magic bullet for that. But what I'm hoping that you take away from this discussion are strategic ways to think about how you are implementing your environments and accounting for your costs that might make you competitive under certain procurements. What levers can you pull that might make you more competitive when you're winning bids going forward? So while maybe you won't be able to recoup these under your existing contracts, going forward, potentially you would be able to. And with that, we have a case study to kind of wrap things up. Excuse me. All right, so here we have a company, Data for You. You can see they're a great company. They got a great logo there with certainly a marketing executive came up with that. And they are a commercial company and a defense contractor, and they've been preparing for CMMC over the last year. And they're evaluating how they should be treating these costs. And so to date, they've incurred $500,000 of CMMC costs, right? They're getting prepared. They've hired a new security manager. They've implemented NIST trainings. They've updated their firewalls. They've got a DLP software. They're rocking and rolling. They're feeling pretty good about it. In addition to that, you've got G&A costs of $2 million, just cost of running your business. You've got commercial direct labor of $8 million and DoD labor of $2 million. So there's kind of your split, 80-20 contract, commercial and DoD work. Under scenario one, right, Data for You says, look, we're going to use this as an opportunity to increase security across our business. 171 is a great framework. We think we're going to grow our DoD business in the future. Let's just put these everywhere. We're going to treat these costs just as we've been treating IT and security costs in the past in our G&A pool. Well, in that scenario, you add the $500,000 to your $2 million, spread it across your base, you have a G&A rate of 25%. Under scenario two, they take the opposite approach. You know what? We want to keep this completely separate. We don't want to touch our commercial work. We are it's the DoD work that's causing us to incur this. We're going to structure our environment in such a way we're only applying it to DoD contracts. So we aren't going to include it in our G&A pool. We're going to create a separate service center and allocate it that way. So under this scenario, our G&A rate drops to 20, because now it's the $2 million over the $10 million. And we have a CMMC service center allocation that's only going to go to our DoD contracts of 25%, right? That's our CMMC service center allocation. All right, last scenario. Data for You is wheeling and dealing. They've got all sorts of things going on. They're going to take a direct approach in the cloud. They're going to collect some indirect costs to allocate over their DoD contracts to a service center. And they're going to apply some things to the business generally. Multi-factor authentication. That's a good process. We'll put that over here. So they're going to put some of this in their G&A. Under this circumstance, you've got a G&A rate of 21% and a CMMC service center rate of 5%, right? We took the direct costs out of our indirect cost rate. So, because that is being directly charged to the contract. So quickly here, we can see a summary, and really what we're going to focus on is the DoD wrap rate. That is just your overall rate. And this is for our DoD work. Under these three scenarios, we now have a DoD, under scenario one, a wrap rate of 25%, just our G&A. Scenario two, a wrap rate of 45%. It's getting the full G&A and the service center allocation. And under scenario three, 26%. So hopefully this kind of helps you see, as you're working on preparing your bids, this can help you how you're presenting your costs. In all these cases, that $500,000 was still incurred. It was just treated differently through how you implemented the requirements and how you accounted for it within your indirect rates. So final thoughts. I know I'm over time. I apologize for that. First off, perform a cost-benefit analysis on discretely identifying CMMC costs, right? This does not make sense for all businesses. If you are one of those pure DoD contractors and you're just going to treat this all the same anyway, getting down to this level of detail may not make sense. But I would also argue, being a DoD contractor, at some point the government's going to require this level of detail. So maybe you should. But just be aware that this isn't always an easy thing to do, and so you should kind of take that into account as you're looking at things this way. Kind of a follow-on to that, you want to understand your accounting system capabilities and your existing procedures. I work with a lot of companies that, even aside from CMMC, are trying to move towards this cost-type environment. And a lot of times that might involve them having to get in a whole new accounting system module or updating the software completely and rewriting their policies. Understand your contractual obligations as they relate to cost reporting. You might already be operating under cost-type contracts. Talk to your accounting department and your program managers to see if a service center allocation for CMMC makes sense and how that might work from a business perspective. And lastly, think about your future state as a government contractor. Just as CMMC can be seen as an opportunity, yes, it's a burden, but it might open up more additional work for you. Cost accounting can be viewed as the same way. If you are a small business and you're going to lose that small business designation, maybe this is something you would look for as an opportunity to start pursuing cost-type work in the future. So keep that in mind as you're kind of thinking this stuff through.